The history and the authenticity of the Chamorro people has been a constant source of conversation and analysis for at least 2 centuries. No term in the history of the Marianas carries more meaning and fosters more mythological uses than the term Chamorro. I want to share my perspective on its current uses as well as its historical use. Perhaps more importantly, I want to examine the historical record of when it went into official use and its potential. This is not a discussion of Chamorro, or how to spell it. The RRO officially died last year, so I just wanted to point that out. It was officially killed by the Guam legislature. So now we're going to have other arguments about Chamorro, but the RRO version is officially dead. This is not a discussion about the origins of the people who settled the Marianas some 4,000 years ago. Those original inhabitants are not the people that we come to know and understand as the Chamorro people. Whenever I teach HI 211, the history of Guam, I begin with the question, where did the Chamorro people come from? And I hear many different responses and the usual theories, including, and I conclude the conversation by pointing out that this is the easiest question in the world to answer. Whomever we think the Chamorro people are, they were formed in the Marianas Islands. That is to say, the sum total of the historical experience of the people, their interaction with each other, their adaptation and utilization of this island and this ocean environment created the conditions for the formation of the people that we now refer to as Chamorros. They are from the Marianas Islands. So, anybody ask you where do the Chamorro people come from? That's the easiest question in the world. They come from the Marianas Islands. They are also called Tautotano, or people of the land, and in this activist indigenous perspective, our historical experience is filled with references to genocide, depopulation, colonization, reducción, and denial of rights. Our task is to recover, revive, and rediscover ourselves, our true selves. I guess our current selves are wanting in some fashion. The imagined past, as in the pre-existing 3,000 years before Magellan's arrival, some 500 years ago, really reflects who we are, our true past, and our true genius. The events which occurred after Magellan arrived tell us a different story. Every dimension of our lives since Magellan is a contested field of power and survival in which we're noble savages living in harmony with nature and with each other. That is our imagined world. However, in reality, most everything that is knowable about our Chamorro experiences and our memories and our documents and our realities is in the past 350 years. And apparently, that's our knowable history, and apparently, most of it is pretty disagreeable. But the term Chamorro itself was not used by Magellan or subsequent voyagers. Early colonizers did not utilize the term either, and Chamorro doesn't really exist in the documentary form until the 19th century. An examination of the term Chamorro becomes necessary if we are to more fully comprehend who we are as Chamorros today, or perhaps equally important, who we are not. We must affix the time of birth for the first Chamorro so that we can understand ourselves more fully. In the Marianas of the 20th century, which I'm looking around, most of you grew up in, most of you are 20th century people. The activist indigenous perspective was just beginning. but the conventional wisdom was pretty clear. As were many native peoples around the world, CHAMORUS were discussed in terms of their physical appearance and bloodline, almost as if they were a breed of animals. MARC's first director and historian Paul Carano wrote, "Present-day Guamanians are as a rule of good physique and pleasing appearance." I'm so glad to hear that. They do not, however, possess the stature and robust health which characterized the ancient CHAMORUS, their remote ancestors. In this conventional wisdom, the pre-contact CHAMORUS were decimated and the men were killed off. Subsequently, the women intermarried or had children with males from all over the world, but mostly Mexicans, Filipinos, or Spaniards. This mixing produced a new group of people who became farmers, not fishermen, Catholics, and were so-called civilized. The process could be ugly in this civilization process because it involved murder, disease, decimation, and forced resettlements, all of which happened to the people of the Marianas. But, you know, in the end, it was all worth it because pre-contact CHAMORUS were no longer primitive. This was the narrative given to the Chamorro people, and they accepted it. Every historical event is a Western-dominated world symbolic of some progress. The dislocation and inhumane treatment experienced at the beginning of colonialization was worth it because it resulted in progress in the end. The West believes that progress occurs in a world that they are managing, and we are the beneficiaries of that progress, regardless of the cost that was paid. There are two curious narratives that come out of this experience in which pre-contact CHAMORUS ceased to exist. These narratives are used to help explain the discontinuity and the degradation of the Chamorro people. The first is the use of non-indigenous males as the driving force of colonial societies and the alteration of the native people. This is part of a colonial narrative which helps cement the domination of outsiders over the native people of the Marianas. The Chamorro people themselves are cast as feminine recipients of these external masculine forces. This dominance of the foreign male narrative is common throughout all of Latin America and present even in the American West. The end result was a race of half-breeds, mixed stock people, mixed stock, that's again the animal reference, that would make money for future DNAancestry.com businesses. Have you all gotten your kit yet? So you can find out how this actually happened in your own life. And you know, it might change who you are. I find those advertisements fascinating because people are no longer who they are until they take a DNA test. For many years, I heard from a well-known Guam historian, "Robert, we are just Mexicans and Filipinos who speak Chamorro." The women taught the mother tongue, and so the language itself survived the colonial experience until the Americans showed up. Now they're killing off the language, doing a pretty good job. I characterized this in the late 1970s in my first foray into teaching on television, culture and education on Guam as the Chamorro denial perspective. Basically, the line of continuity between ancient Chamorros and modern-day Chamorros was broken, and that any claim to a direct line was historically and culturally inaccurate in the 1970s and 1980s. I argued that we could legitimately reconstruct the connection. The term Guamanian itself was used and was an impediment to the process of rediscovery, Guamanian was weaponized as a force for discontinuity in the cultural continuity discussion about Chamorro people in the 20th century. The second colonial narrative, which discusses native and conquered peoples as the result of race mixing. Interestingly, the race mixing is explained as weakening the native peoples and sapping their strength. See, the more mixed you are, the weaker you get. Their physical condition and their moral fiber. Pure-blooded or purebred natives were seen as possessing dignity and admirable physical qualities, which have been lost through racial admixture. The colonial narrative on mixing bloodlines doesn't enhance the native breed, it degrades it. One would think that physical contact with colonizers would result in offspring who were stronger and smarter and more eager to engage the future. Instead, if you're a product of these admixtures, you are half-breeds who have lost your dignity. It is one of the strangest and most contradictory of colonial narratives which has been placed upon native peoples, and native peoples accept that. That's the danger of that. In attempting to understand this, the work of the physical anthropologist Jane Underwood is crucial. I've only met her once, and she's not my relative. But she has a great name. She put together a population of history which assumed, which examined the ups and downs, the vicissitudes of the population of the Marianas, and even the terminology that had been used through the centuries. In the native origins of the Neo-Chamorros of the Marianas Islands, published in Micronesia in 1971, she recounted the documentary evidence of the population history of the Marianas. The islands had a population of 3,197 natives and 427 mestizos in the year 1710, which was a significant drop from the 50 to 100,000 estimates of the missionaries upon the arrival of San Vitores. Of course, the missionaries had lots of reasons to exaggerate, but it was still pretty obvious that significant depopulation had occurred as a result of warfare, disease, and perhaps a loss of will to live. It's important to note that by the end of the time period of the so-called Spanish Chamorro Wars, Chamorro women were deliberately aborting their babies, and in some instances would take the babies down and drown them at the shoreline, simply because the world had changed so dramatically for them. Quoting Freycinet, Underwood points out that out of 3,169 residents in 1786, this is about 75 years later, there were 1,318 natives. Freycinet finally reported that only one pure-blooded man and woman existed in 1817. So, you know, it's obvious that if you have a bunch of people who are so-called mestizos and a handful that are people who are Indios or natives, that over time the natives would have to spend all their time with each other or they're simply going to disappear. She recounted this even as she seemed to argue against a substantial admixture of foreign blood into the Marianas, at least to the point of extinction for Chamorros. Extinction of the ancients was the conventional wisdom in the 20th century when Jane Underwood wrote this article. The significance of her work needs to be understood in this context. She was the first one to provide physical evidence that contradicted the belief that the pre-contact Chamorro contribution to their descendants was negligible. She wrote, "The lack of congruence between the expected biological attributes of a hybrid population to which the native contribution would have been so negligible, and the observed data from anthropometric, osteological, and blood studies among Neo-Chamorro groups has proven irreconcilable. She argued that the Neo-Chamorros weren't as neo as some people thought. Now, it's important to know that the only way we can uncover this is to continue to study the remains of people. Unless you just don't want to know. You have to study it. If you don't want to know, then don't study it. That's an important thing that remains. I'm sure if Jane Underwood were alive, she'd still say that. But they still weren't called Chamorros just yet. And in the census data throughout the 18th century in the Marianas and the early 19th century, the natives were referred to as Indios, and their mixed progeny were called mestizo, in keeping with Spanish colonial practices. Frequently, they were called Marianos, since they were from the Marianas Islands. Freycinet gave a review of the numbers and the nomenclature for the natives of the island, and this is where most of the conversation comes from when we talk about the origin of the word Chamorro. It really comes from Freycinet. Freycinet, he offered a couple of explanations for the use of the term Chamorro, which was starting to be used in the early part of the 19th century. And he said, including the version given by Don Luis de Torres, who, you know, is a direct ancestor for some of us here. So Don Luis de Torres, who claimed that it was a corruption of drop the rudder, or as Larry Cunningham would say, don't use the rudder. So that's pretty interesting. Chapmu Ulin, Ulin's rudder, which was shouted by the chiefs as the canoes started to get near the foreign vessels. They would say, Chapmu Ulin! I don't know, they got Chamorro out of that. But, you know, it's pretty good. I don't know why they didn't get Chamu Ulin out of that. But then there's also the use of the Spanish word to describe shade heads, which was omnipresent in pre-contact Chamorro society. In either case, Freycinet was pretty sure that the Aboriginal race is far from forming not only the majority of the population today, but of the bloodline of the population. He did give an uncharitable description of the current inhabitants, which almost everybody gives to the Chamorros once they find out that there's some kind of mixed breed people. He did give this version. He said, they are not constrained by anything and blindly give free rein to their passions and wishes. So these people were disorderly and just, you know, did everything they wanted. And so I thought he was talking about millennials, but it was too early in history for that. Freycinet's view of Chamorro genetics and its impact on the 20th century denial convention wisdom was very strong. The colonial narrative of a degraded population characterized by a lack of strength and lack of pre-contact bloodlines was in full bloom in the early 1900s and already existing from the previous century. Writing in the 1880s, Spanish Governor Francisco Olive Garcia reviews the nomenclature as well, and he describes them. He refers to them as Marianos, which was a common term in the 18th century. He reports that in 1825, there were 2,683 indigents, meaning natives, and 3,220 and 18 in the other category. The other groups included both mestizos and criollos, who were assumed to be basically from European roots, who were born in the colonies. Olive also reports that Governor Villalobos started a reorganization of the government, which was described as the reforms in the 1830s. So Villalobos changed the nature of government in the Marianas Islands. These reforms included new taxes in various economic activities and the creation of cabecerias or barangays with leaders called cabezas, the head of the barangay. And the barangay is a term that is borrowed from the Philippines, and of course cabezas from Spanish. But interestingly, this became in CHAMORU, barangay became balangay. And this was still in fairly common use, I would say, up until World War II. After World War II, hardly any Chamorro speaker knows what balangay is. But I have heard the term, and it was used to describe small units in much the same way that you see barangay in the Philippines. According to Olive, everybody was designated as Chamorro in the 1830s in order to avoid higher taxes, which was imposed on mestizos. So now you had a choice. You could be a mestizo and pay taxes, or you could be a Chamorro and avoid taxes. Count me in. So the social value of being a mestizo did not outweigh the benefits of reduced taxes. So the actual first use of the term Chamorro for official purposes occurred in the 1830s. And it coincided with these government reforms, the imposition of new taxes, and to some extent, it reflected also the creation of an emerging group of people who equally called themselves Chamorro. Olive landed in Guam in November 1884, a few months after the assassination of Governor Dos Passos by a Chamorro soldier named Jose Salas in 1884. Salas and 3 other Chamorro soldiers, Agun, Acosta, and Mendiola, were executed in 1885 for being part of a plot to overthrow Spanish rule. So within 50 years, the consciousness of Chamorro, being a member of some group of people called Chamorro, these soldiers were not killing Dos Passos and shouting, "Hurrah sent us here," or "Matapan, long live Matapan," because that wasn't part of their worldview. They were seeing themselves as a group different from the Spaniards and having an understanding that they may have connection to the ancient Chamorros, but they weren't doing it in the name of the ancient Chamorros. Olive recounts how things have become degraded in the Marianas Islands because Chamorros were chamorizing everything. They were chamorizing their social reality. Their ability to speak Castellano started to drop off. A lot of older people spoke more English than they did Castellano because they were trading with the whalers. And so in Olive's eyes, this was emerging as a slightly different group, a little bit out of control. Filipinos originally did not include Tagalogs, Visayans, Ilocanos, and certainly not Moros. It took the development of Filipino nationalism to co-opt the word and forever change the meaning of Filipino. One of the first appropriations of the term Filipino was by Jose Rizal, who wrote about Filipino youth in his poem A la Juventud Filipina, first published in 1879. Although it praises the Spanish contribution, he clearly argues that the future of the Philippines belongs to young Filipinos like himself. Some tried to take the nationalist project further. Andres Bonifacio suggested Haring Bayang Katagulugan, instead of Republica and Filipinas. The fact that it was really arguing like he was creating a Tagalog nation, because that's the root word there in Katagulugan, was being declared, ensured the proposal's short term of life, because the unity of different languages and ethnic groups in the Philippines was possible only under the use of the term that the colonial reality gave them. A group of islands named after King Felipe and calling themselves Filipinos. Mexicano is based on the Nahua, Aztec word Mexica. It was utilized early as a term to describe all who lived in Mexico or New Spain as far back as the 16th century. As an official term, Mexicano coincided with the Mexican War of Independence in the 1810s. It is a word most associated with the annual Grito de Mexicano on the 16th of September. As an official cultural and political philosophy, Mexico followed the mestizaje model, and it is reflected in the 1917 Constitution, which declares Mexico to be indivisible, pluricultural. It celebrates its mestizo roots, doesn't shy away from them, it celebrates them. It says that is the core essence of the identity of Mexico. Now, in both Mexico and the Philippines, it is possible, even today, to be an indigenous person. But it usually means you are not in the mainstream of the national project. Just ask the Ifugao or the Mayans. They're not in the mainstream of the Philippines or in Mexico. Today, I don't think of very many individuals on Guam who look to Filipino or Mexican national project as a source for inspiration or comparison for Guam or the Marianas Islands. I may be the only one. I'm the only guy who thinks this. I may be the only guy. Maybe others won't. If they look at the record, they might think differently. People are forced to look at influence and practices and even acknowledge some common ancestry under the aegis of the Spanish Empire. But today's Chamorro reality and sense of Chamorro-ness, it is done begrudgingly. It's not done to recognize it as part of their past. It's done in a begrudging way, as if they resent that it's part of their past. That's dangerous. It's hard to imagine, and it's hard to ignore titizas, or tamales, or atulinilotes, or porto, or bibinka, or tuba. These are all quintessentially Chamorro, and they're part of the Chamorro historical experience. Yet, of course, the last set comes from the Philippines, and the former set comes from Mexico. Now, what do young people look to for inspiration today? Okay. We're more likely to look at indigenous peoples around the world for inspiration and connections. The ones that lend themselves the most to comparison are indigenous groups who also live in modern Western societies as minority groups. This seems to be our Chamorro fate as well. For those comparisons, it seems appropriate to look at the Kanaka Maoli in Hawaii or the Maori in Aotearoa or New Zealand. Hawaii gives us dancing and chanting, which is immediately sensed in almost every portrayal of Chamorro pre-contact culture. You can see it. Almost all of the dance practitioners and all the mentors learned their craft from the Hawaiian experience. Even Carlos Taitano, who conceptualized the Tautotano as the vehicle for cultural revival, acknowledges that he was inspired through contact with Hawaiians in the 1930s when he was going to school there. Ironically, many of these contacts came through Hawaiianized Taitanos, other relatives, Taitanos who had moved to Hawaii as part of the whaling experience, and they themselves had become Hawaiianized. The Kingdom of Hawaii was not exactly a pre-contact, Western contact institution, but it provided the basis for remembering and taking note of almost every Hawaiian cultural practice that could be committed to memory or print. It's important to remember that the Hawaiian speaking and writing government entity known as the Kingdom of Hawaii came into existence in the 1800s, a few years after contact with the West, and 150 years after the Chamorro contact with the West. The Hawaiian National Project was derailed by the United States, and they're now part of the 50th state. At this point in time, the Hawaiians have a much more recent memory of their pre-contact past because their pre-contact past is more recent. And they have extensive records of that past, and therefore can reconstruct their ancient past in ways that are simply not available for Chamorros. Well, they have an official apology, U.S. apology for the overthrow, and a possible pathway to developing a nation within a nation via legislation like the Akaka Bill. It seems less than satisfying as hardcore independence activists, but one does acknowledge but the knowledge of pre-contact culture is not only recoverable in Hawaii, it's knowable. That's a very important thing to remember. Essentially, the same historical situation exists with the Maori of New Zealand, Aotearoa. The Maori were established as indigenous peoples of the islands and lived their lives through tribal organizations. With the arrival of Western settlers in larger and larger numbers, British control had to be acknowledged, and this was done in the Treaty of Waitangi. In this framework through which special status is accorded to the Maori, even as they became a minority group in their own homeland. In many ways, their insistence on an indigenous continuity has accorded them unique standing within New Zealand, including widespread support for culture and language programs and official status as the primary people of the country of New Zealand. Like the Hawaiians, and unlike the Chamorros, the Maoris experienced the weight of outsider contact within the past 150 to 200 years. Moreover, they lived in a pretty large country, New Zealand, in which they could sustain their communities apart from others that were simply not thinkable for Chamorros who were forced to live in villages around churches. Both the Hawaiians and the Maoris have an indigenous pre-contact culture which is knowable. Moreover, between the haka and the hula, they have a cachet which is hard to deny. Who doesn't want to learn how to do the haka? Who doesn't want to learn how to do the hula? And trying to find ways that somehow Chamorros are connected to that. They are forceful, they are direct, and know how to maneuver in societies in which they do not form the majority. International recognition of indigenous groups has helped create safe places for advocacy, meetings, and mutual support. This is embodied in the UN Declaration of Indigenous Rights, passed in 2007. Interestingly, the 4 nations which voted against the Declaration of Indigenous Rights are Australia, the United States, Canada, and New Zealand. Well, New Zealand later recanted and changed its vote. The other 3 haven't changed their vote. The application of the term indigenous to the conditions of the Chamorro people was first formulated by the Organization of People for Indigenous Rights, OPR. As the chief political strategist for that organization, which had several luminaries that are here this evening, including Laura and Narissa and Hope back there, and Rosa, and is anyone else here that I'm missing? BJ here. These are all people who were involved in this illustrious organization, OPR. So, as the chief political strategist, I plead guilty to using and applying the term indigenous to the Chamorro experience. In fact, I was the first one to do it, and older people come up, indigenous, indigenous. You know, I used to get that inquiry, and I would try to explain, I would give all the really great explanations. It was clear to me at the time that the Chamorro people had many roads to follow for the recognition of political sovereignty and their residual rights as people of the land, as Tautotano. The OPR imaginatively used the combination of the claim to indigeneity and our status as a non-self-governing territory as the basis to proceed to the next step in political status development. That was not available to any other people. So there was a little bit of creativity in that. So the non-self-governing territory status gives you the right not to indigenous status. It gives you the right to nationhood. The right to nationhood is different than the right to indigenous status. You accept your struggle for indigenous status if that's all you think you can ever have. But if you give up your right to nationhood, you sacrifice everything. That's the distinction. So the OPR seized upon this by saying we have a status as non-self-governing territory, which people were unaware of. So I went to the UN. I was the first petitioner to go to the UN. And when I went there to the UN, it was in the middle of the Cold War. I gave the presentation. The Cubans and the Iraqis and the Russians, they loved my presentation. The Australians and the Americans, not so much. But they loved my presentation. And the commentary was great. But just to show you the extent of the paranoia at the time and the widespread confusion of the time, I was telling Chris Perez Howard and Ron Tehan, who came along for the ride. They said, where are you going tomorrow morning? I said, I'll catch up with you in the UN. So I went over to the US delegation, which is right across the street. And I had my presentation. I went over there and I told the security guard, I'm going over there across the street to give a presentation today. Here it is. Then I left. So I could always say, well, I gave them advance notice. Because I don't know. Because the rumors were incredible in those days. That if you went and testified against the US in an international forum like the UN, you could be charged with treason and all these other things. So, you know, what did I know? I wasn't, you know, I think I was all of 33 at the time, you know, trying to figure it out. Now, the question before us is to develop a model which helps us understand whether Chamorro is primarily a reference to an indigenous population of the Marianas or an emerging nationality, a group that parallels Mexicans or Filipinos. Are we engaged in a project for the future or a indigenous rescue effort from the past? When you add that quadrant, the people who look at history will look at the history that puts Guam and the Marianas there between the Philippines and Mexico. Of course, that Mexican-Filipino access that goes back and forth is a product of the Manila Gang and is a product of Spanish colonization. That's what helped create that access. That's what helped create those policies. That's what helped create Villalobos and Olive and Garcia and help introduce those food products that we now think of as quintessentially Chamorro. But today we have an indigenous imagination as well. We have a Kanaka Maoli fascination. I would call it a fascination with indigenous roots. So the quadrant model that I'm presenting here is not meant to be mathematical, nor is it designed to simplify the historical experience. All of us, especially those of us who think of ourselves as Tautotano, who think of ourselves as Chamorros, we're the products of this experience and our imagination. In many ways, this quadrant represents the intersection between what we have lived through and what we think we are. The intersection provides the basis for determining our future. We want to be inspired by our own imagination as a pre-contact indigenous society, which goes back hundreds of years. But we cannot ignore history, even when it seems disagreeable. Moreover, the understanding of Chamorro as a nationality in waiting is not dispiriting. It's not necessarily dispiriting. The quadrant has possibilities and carries with it not just a legacy of conquest and degradation, but I believe of hope and possibility. Now, the issues which lay before us, culturally and politically, and in terms of Chamorro survivability, are multifaceted and require a broad understanding of the sweep of the Chamorro experience. The reference points for understanding this experience are all in front of us. They're all in front of us in physical form in HAGATNA. I hope you go to HAGATNA tomorrow and just drive down that street and just bear witness to these physical contradictions that are everywhere, speaking to the quadrant, messing up the quadrant. We're not sure what the continuity or the consistency is all about. The reference points for understanding. At the beautiful new museum, which is named the Antonio Palomo Guam Museum and Educational Facility, we are inspired and perhaps a little confused by the symbolism selected to explain our historical past. On the front walls, we are given excerpts from the Whanohi CHamoru, originally written in English as Stanley Chamorro by Dr. Ramon Sablan in the 1930s. On the other side, we're given words from Hurao's speech, an exhortation to people to rise up against the outsiders, which was reportedly delivered in the year 1670. There are two human figures in front of the museum. I don't know, they look like humanoids to me. Both male, interestingly both male, which are depictions of ancient Chamorros, robust and physically well-formed and consistent with the narrative about the physicality of pre-contact Chamorro people and indigenous people. These two look directly across the street, and they're looking right at the Plaza de España. They also look directly at the formerly rotating statue of Pope John II, commemorating the 1981 visit of the Pontiff. Overwhelming the plaza, when you're looking at the plaza from that, is the Guam Insular Force Guard Memorial, which seems awfully out of place to me, but it's there, commemorating the December 10th, 1941 action of the Insular Guard against the Japanese at the plaza. The inherent contradictions of all these physical representations of Chamorro and Guam history are laid out for us to absorb and make coherent, if it is at all possible. Of course, coherence and consistency is not the point of history, but it is the point of narratives embedded in our minds, which must come to coherent conclusions about the sum total of our collective experience. Where does all this lead to? What are we left to believe? And how are we supposed to act as a result of all of these forms in front of us? We have a Guam museum named after Antonio Palomo. Now, the name Antonio Palomo, well, most of us know Antonio Palomo, he's a great man. But the name Antonio Palomo is decidedly Chamorro name, as it would be understood in the Chamorro that was born in the 1830s. That's a real Chamorro name. The name has nothing in common with Kepuha or Matapan. We have Hurao's words of uncertain origin, which were reported in Morales and Ligovia decades after 1870. We are told that the words are almost 350 years old. We know that the words were first written decades after 1670, and were not translated into Chamorro until 40 years ago. These Chamorro words which are used would have been entirely comprehensible to Antonio Palomo. He'd get it, although awkward and perhaps impenetrable to Hurao himself. I don't know whether Hurao would understand those words, but it's certain that Palomo would have. The words look across the street to the Plaza de España, which was not the original name of that area. As reported in Olive's notes, the Plaza de España was on the east side of the church. On the west side of the church was the Plaza de Magallanes. It's named after Magellan, Plaza de Magallanes. Hurao is really confronting Magallanes, at least symbolically. Maybe not, maybe it's just a kind of a coincidence. Huh? Interestingly, on the back side of the museum, we read words which pledge loyalty to the United States through the words of Antonio Wampat, which who stood out as the premier Guam political leader for the first generation after World War II. He stated, "The desire and aspiration of our people to have a legally constituted government and to become citizens of the only country to which we owe unswerving allegiance have long been maintained." I don't know why these words are on the backside, or why American citizenship is not the apex of our development as a people. Perhaps we're ambivalent about it. And this could be entirely understandable. The 500th anniversary of Magellan's circumvention is coming up in 2021. Only 4 years from now. Actually, maybe 3.5. You go back to March, right? About 3.5 years from now. How we choose to commemorate this event will create that collision course. I doubt that we will restore the name of the plaza given to and call it Plaza de Magallanes. I doubt that anyone want to suggest that? Write to your favorite senator. See if they, well, Senator Will Castro, maybe Senator Castro will pick this up. Given the recent demise of Columbus as a holiday, and I don't know whether you've been reading this, Columbus is now falling on hard times. So now Columbus Day is now being declared Indigenous Day. It's just voted in LA City Council last week. It's now officially Indigenous Day, 14-1. I don't know what's going to happen to the Knights of Columbus. What's going to happen to the Knights of Columbus? Are they going to have to change their name? They're going to become Indigenous Knights? Or what exactly is going to happen? And that's the intricacies of trying to extract this. What are we going to do with the Magellan marker in Humata? And the historical addiction that we have to commemorating that visit. whatever we do, I hope that we'll forever put to rest the idea that Magellan actually showed up in Amata. This still leaves us the question about the birth of the name Chamorro and what it means for us today. Going back to the quadrant, we see the inherent contradictions implicit in the terms Filipino and Mexican, which have been resolved by Filipinos and Mexicans through the process of nation building. These are terms of nationality, terms which are meant to encapsulate the creation of a new nation. The nations of the Philippines and Mexico exist as a result of historical events, not indigenous imagination. Like any nation, they must present the events of the past as leading to no other conclusion than the formation of their respective nations, their nationality, and their essence as a people with a unique historical experience. As with any nation building, they can engage in myth-making. More importantly, they can synthesize and make coherent their story. Perhaps what will happen to the Chamorro people, perhaps we'll only see it at the museum. And maybe that will be the end of the Chamorro people. Now, there's two things that we must do in order to ensure that those things do not happen. The first and foremost is to create and maintain a Chamorro-speaking community. Because the Chamorro language, Lingwahe CHamoru, Fino CHamoru, Fino Anza, Fino Tautotano, no matter what you call it, is the clearest link between all of those elements. That's the clearest link. Everything else is imagined and, in a sense, forced. The second thing is that you have to understand the birth of the Chamorro people in the 19th century. This means that we have to stop leapfrogging our history. We have to go right back into the colonial period. And we have to study what happened. We have to find out who these people were. And how did they come to see themselves as Chamorros? How did they identify themselves as Chamorros? These people I'm talking about are some of them might be my grandparents, some are old enough to be them, but certainly my great-grandparents. And for most of you, maybe your great-great-grandparents. When you asked them who they were, they said they were Chamorros. What did they mean by that? They didn't mean that they, they understood that they were connected in some fashion to Hurao and Matapan, but they didn't see that connection. They didn't wear laddie stones around their neck or sinahi. They didn't do those things. Now, I'm not arguing that you shouldn't do those things, but that isn't how they envisioned their world. In fact, they were afraid of laddie stones, So they spent all their time saying, don't go near laddie stones. And then here, what are we doing in the late 20th century? We're making bus stops looking like laddie stones. If you can imagine your great-grandparents coming back and saying, hey, you're tempting fate. Why are you doing that? So you have to kind of understand what those people, how those people saw the world. That task is learning what is knowable, not what is not knowable. You can know it. You can know it. And the main vehicle to knowing that is just, a few feet from here, over in MARC. That's the amazing part of it. But if you want to spend more time imagining rather than researching, then we will never really know who these Chamorro people were. I said a lot of things, and I know that some of this is not quite as well formed as I wanted it to be. But the quadrant is important, because the quadrant is that intersection. It's that intersection between history and imagination, between who we are and what we experience. And in order to continue to triangulate and make the world safe for the Chamorro people, we have to engage in that. My favorite statement about the Chamorro nation came from Paul Bordallo. and he gave a presentation here. And he said, I'm a member of the Chamorro Nation. I just don't belong to any organization. Now, when he said that, he understood that the Chamorro people were a nation in waiting. He didn't understand it as a pitch for indigeneity. He understood it as an historical project and process that has been abbreviated and truncated. And so the ready models for that, the imagination for that, is the Kanaka Maoli and the Maori, and the ready experience, practical experience of that lies in the Philippines and in Mexico, and both countries whom we share a great deal in common in our experience and our bloodline. So thank you very much. Don't lunes dus masi.